Hello friends, we welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. We are very pleased to have a distinguished writer, an editor, and educator with us today to talk to us about her writing, her editing, and her career, and that is Edie Pendarvis. And Edie Pendarvis joins us here on the program, and she was born in Weeksbury, Kentucky. She spent her childhood in the coal towns of eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia until her family moved in Florida, part of the out-migration of Appalachians that we've seen go on in this area for the last 3/4 of a century or so. She retired from Marshall University in the College of Education. She now lives in Huntington, where she does some adjunct teaching and consulting, freelance writing and editing, and serves as the book review editor for Now and Then, the Appalachian magazine. Her poems, essays, and stories appear in anthologies and periodicals such as Appalachian Heritage, Appalachian Journal, Cafe Review, Indiana Review, and Louisville Review. Her most recent poetry collection, Like the Mountains of China, and a book of family memoirs, Raft, Tide, and Railroad, How We Lived and Died, were published by Blair Mountain Press. She's written several young adult biographies of Nobel Prize laureates in literature, published in dual language editions by Shanghai Foreign Language Education Press, and her writing in these works and other works reflects her commitment to the Appalachian region and its egalitarian spirit. And we are delighted to have Edie Pendarvis with us today to talk to us about some of these great books and her career. So, Edie, welcome to Chapters. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Ellie. I'm glad to be here.
So, I wanted to ask you about a work that you did most recently, and that was a partnership with the Jesse Stewart Foundation, a collection of true stories that took place in West Virginia, Kentucky, and Southern Ohio called Appalachian Murders and Mysteries. So, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what your role was in this project, and how did you and Jim Gifford, who is the director of the Jesse Stewart Foundation, get connected or team up on this project?
Well, it's kind of interesting. One thing we were thinking about, we had done a collection called Appalachian Love Stories several years ago, and we really enjoyed doing that. And we kept thinking, well, we want to do something to follow it up, but we're not sure what. So we thought of this and that, and nothing that we got really excited about. But then Jim said, what about murders and mysteries in Appalachia? That's been done some, but not focusing on central Appalachia. So I have there was a murder in my family. My grandmother was murdered, and my mother saw it. And actually, I saw it, but I was 6 months old. So that has always made me kind of fascinated, I guess, and both fascinated and upset by murders and how far-reaching their effects are, how much they can influence even generations later, the victims and the families of the murder too. So we thought, well, we'll do murders just around central Appalachia, southern Ohio, eastern Kentucky, and West Virginia. So that's what we decided to do, and then we solicited murders from different places. Some people we knew, we put out, Jim advertised for essays, and these are all true stories, of course. And so then we had to call a little bit, because of course we got more than we could use. But that's a little bit of the history of murder and Appalachian Murders and Mysteries.
How long did it take you as the editor on this, once the story started coming in? Did you wait to get a collection together and then start editing? Did you edit as you went? How did that process work?
We edited after we had about a fourth of the stories. I think there were about 23 stories in it. After we had the first 4 or 5 stories, we started editing, and then we edited. And several times, usually, we'd give them back, and then the people would send them back again. So we edited up from nearly the beginning until nearly the end of the process. I think, actually, the book did go pretty fast, because, as books go. I think it took us maybe almost 2 years, which is fast for a nonfiction book, especially. Well, for any kind of book.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you about one. There's, as you mentioned, there's 23 stories in here. They're all excellent. I enjoyed them all. But there's one in particular I wanted to ask you about, because a lot of people in the Huntington area especially might remember this, but people in the whole tri-state region might remember this, and that was Juliette Buffington Enslow's murder. It actually remains unsolved, and Jonathan Jeffrey did this story
right.
For the collection. Tell us a little bit about that story and what happened to her and why maybe this or why it is still unsolved, why nobody's ever been caught.
Right, that is an intriguing one. And she was murdered in her own house in Huntington. In the morning, they found her dead, and she had been choked, and they didn't know who did it. And the only suspect, the only person who was ever, well, I think he was arrested, the only person who was ever arrested, but he was not tried for the murder, was her son, who they thought was addicted to painkillers after he'd had an injury. But they never charged, he was never found guilty, and no one was ever charged and tried for that murder. And years later, they found one of her diamond rings in the gutter near her house, but they never could solve it. So that's one that's still that keeps us wondering who could have done that, and was it her son? It'd be horrible to think it was. That was it her son, and was he that desperate? Of course, that's one that resonates these days so much, because so many people have problems with drug addiction and get so desperate that that one kind of resonates now, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. When you put a book like this together, it seems like that murders and mysteries also, but folk stories are such a huge part of our Appalachian culture. I know you've studied the Appalachian region. You're from here. You've taught in this region for a number of years. What is it about Appalachia that makes all these things so interesting and makes us still be drawn to them as the generations go by? We're still drawn to murders and mysteries and folk stories and ghost stories and all the things that we hear about Appalachia. What makes that so unique?
I do have a theory about that.
Okay.
Now that you mentioned it, being a professor, of course I have a theory. I think it's how long we stay in this place. We have a heritage here. We're not a very mobile community, and so we care about the generations that were here before us. They mean more to us maybe than if we had just come here a few years ago and our past was way behind us, 3 or 4 states away or a continent away. I really think it's how long we've been here, so many of us.
And we even see that, if you go to a lot of small towns in Appalachia, you still see that today. You've got on one street 2 or 3 generations of family living either on the same street or right next door to each other in some cases.
Right.
The grandmother and grandfather live here, mom and dad live here, and then the children of the parents and the grandchildren of the grandparents still live together. So it's interesting.
Right, up a hollow.
Yeah,
I remember a private detective one time telling me there's no way he could go into a hollow and not have 3 or 4 cars following him from the family, because they were all family in the hollow.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're trying to serve a summons or sneak up on somebody, you have trouble.
Absolutely, that's very true. That is so very true.
I also think I think that's part of why we're so polite to each other too. Mm-hmm. If we do somebody wrong and say rude things to people, it's going to last a long time. We're going to be here a long time. It's not like we're just in the neighborhood a year or so.
Yeah, or passing through,
Right.
Yeah, very
Right.
true. I think that's an excellent point. So that is a great collection, the Appalachian Murders and Mysteries, True
Thank
Stories
you.
of West Virginia, Kentucky, and Southern Ohio, and you and Jim Gifford did a great job with that. But I want to ask you also about some of your poetry, and we've got several of your books with us today, and we're also going to talk about your biographies as well here in just a minute. But one of your poetry collections, Ghost Dance Poems, is really a unique collection. Tell us a little bit about some of the themes that emerge in that collection of poetry.
That one really is less Appalachian and more set in the Southwest. My daughter moved to New Mexico, and actually the cover is from an artwork from the Southwest, a woman who does work in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I just kind of got fascinated with the with the Native American tales from that area, and combined a lot of their, the ghost dance. Do you remember the Indian ghost dance
I
that
do.
they hoped that, and this is going to the past again, I guess with Appalachians we're going to do that. In the 1800s, several tribes started doing ghost dance, began to subscribe to a religion called the ghost dance religion, where they were trying to bring back the buffalo and the dead warriors. It was when they were finally seeing, I think, defeat all around from the whites. And so they turned to a spiritual hope. And so that, in a way, these ghost dance poems are me looking at the past and trying to bring back and have people see and love some of the things I've seen and loved. So it's kind of a ghost dance too.
Very good. And tell us a little bit, you mentioned a little bit about the cover, that it's kind of emblematic of what goes on in New Mexico or in the Southwest. Well, what's going on that cover? You know, we see the crows, we see that what are they doing in terms of on that image?
And you know, I never know the difference between a raven and a crow.
I don't know. I could have misspoken on that too.
I always think of these as ravens. And I believe that the artist calls them ravens, and that is at sunset. So she did not call it ghost dance poems. I think she called it ravens and sunset or something like that. So I'm not sure what they're doing, but since my birth sign in Native American zodiac is a raven, that's part of why I chose that too.
Very good. Excellent. Excellent. And another collection of poetry that we have with us today that you did was Like the Mountains of China. So tell us a little bit about that collection of poetry and what are some of the themes that emerged there.
I got to visit China. I was so lucky, but this was a long time ago. And someone had said, you're going to feel so out of place and foreign there. But when I got there, I felt so at home. I was really surprised. Even in Beijing, which is a big city, it felt like a country city. Now, this was 1995 or 96, so I'm not saying it's like Beijing would be now. Especially there was not the air pollution that there is now. But I felt so at home there, and I think partly it's because so much of that country was still so agricultural that I felt like the mountains here are like the mountains of China. So a lot of the poems in that book are drawn from visiting China, but also it's pointing out that the mountains here and the rivers here are very much like the mountains and rivers there, and that we have much in common with the Chinese people.
And I know that Blair Mountain Press has been someone that has published some of your works, a poetry collection called Like the Mountains of China, which we just talked about, also a book of family memoirs, Raft, Tide, and Railroad, How We Lived and Died. How did you find Blair Mountain Press, and what was the process like working with them?
It was really, Victor Depta is the editor and the publisher of Blair Mountain Press, and we were both writers. He's from West Virginia, he's from Buffalo Creek, and so we met at Marshall, and he had started his publishing company a few years before that, and he was, kind enough to I'm not even sure I submitted that, but he read it and liked it and published Like the Mountains of China.
Very good.
And he did do Raft, Tide, and Railroad too, and I think this one. So I have several with Blair Mountain Press, and we share the similar concern for the environment and the waters and the rivers that here in the mountains. So we had that I was on his editorial board for a while too, so I also helped him select some other books and do a book, an anthology on coal that with Chris Green edited.
Yes. The director of the...
He's at Berea now, at the Appalachian Center at Berea.
Yeah,
right.
The Lloyd Jones Appalachian Center. Yes, absolutely. And I think taught at Marshall at one time
right,
too.
He did.
Yeah, very good. Excellent. That's great. I wanted to ask you, before we get into some of your other books, about editing. And, we hear publishers tell writers, and we hear veteran writers tell aspiring writers all the time, get your work edited. You need an editor. You need to find somebody that can edit your work. In your experience, how does an editor help a writer, and what is it that an editor provides a writer that is so beneficial when it comes to poetry or manuscripts of fiction, nonfiction, or whatever it is that they're writing? That relationship, why is that important? Why does a writer need a good editor, maybe a couple of editors that they can really trust and rely on?
Well, first I'd like to say that I think once a story or a poem is competent, Grammatically it's competent and proofread and logistically makes sense and is interesting, then it's a matter of taste. Then it's a matter of, is this what the editor is looking for or not? But I think what an editor offers most of all, and there aren't many nowadays, you almost have to have your manuscript really close to ready to go these days because publishers can't afford editors and proofreaders as much as they used to. But I think it's just a different perspective that if you're a competent writer who's thought a lot about it and has belonged to a writing group and had other people read it, then really I think the editor can offer an overall larger perspective about how well things fit together and how other readers will view it. But the days of when hear about, I know you've heard people send these manuscripts that were in torn pages or out of a drawer to a book, but that doesn't happen now.
Yeah.
Now it's just about got to be ready to go.
Yeah. I mean, it needs to be almost as if that you could slap a cover on it and send it out that good.
Right.
At that level.
Yes.
What should a writer look for in an editor, and what does an editor like most about working with a writer? In terms of, because so much of it is personality,
right,
and it's relationships and starting one, developing it. But what should a writer look for in an editor, and what does an editor like to deal with in terms of a writer?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that I can't forget that Sharon McCrum told me once about, and this is the different perspective thing. She wasn't being an editor, but she was being a critic for me. This was a Heinemann workshop. And she was reading the first of my story, and she said, "Now, who cares about two kids reading comic books?" And she was basically saying, nobody's going to get into the second or third page of your story. You better have a great lead in. So I guess writers like editors who will tell them honest, hard things like that, like you got to pick it up. And as far as, I guess editors like writers that are compliant, because you're looking for something that will fit a particular book. I mean, the editor's looking overall. They have an audience in mind. And so the story may be really good and close to what you want, but you want them to be willing to do a little more work to make it exactly what will fit that book or that audience.
Okay, very good. And I think that's excellent advice because, working with an editor is just like any other relationship. Sometimes people connect and sometimes they don't, and,
right,
and it's okay if you don't. But I'm glad you mentioned that editors are there to make the writer's writing better, and it's not personal and it's not
right,
vindictive. It's to take your story and make it better. Yeah.
And then, as I say, honesty is what I, as a writer, would want most from an editor or any kind of critic.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Very good. Something else that you've done, Eddie, in your career is write some of these biographies, young adult biographies of really Nobel Prize laureates in literature, and we've got several of them here with us today. So I wanted to ask you first about this one because this is one that is about a favorite writer of mine, William Faulkner, and this is A Way Down South, a biography of William Faulkner. So tell us a little bit about writing this kind of book and targeting it more for a young adult audience.
I'm glad you picked up that one because that's my favorite of the four.
Oh, good.
And we started with Pearl Buck. Christina St. Clair and I wanted to do a biography of Pearl Buck. And we knew Berlin Fong, who's a translator. This is a dual language book. And my son says, "So you don't speak Chinese or read Chinese?" He said, "So you don't really know if that translation is what you said or if it's a recipe." And I said, "Yes, you're right, but I'm pretty sure it's the biography of Faulkner." But anyway, they liked the Pearl Buck. The publishers, we sent to Houghton Mifflin here, and they didn't answer us. So we went to Berlin Fong, who was a translator, knew a Chinese the Shanghai press, that they might be interested. So we went to them, but we did hear after we'd already done a contract with them, we did hear on the Pearl Buck from Houghton Mifflin, but it was too late for that. But the Faulkner I love. I think to me, it's the best of the four because he had such an interesting childhood and because he actually is an Appalachian writer, and yet he's not usually thought of as an Appalachian writer. And he had such a crazy life. Of course, all of the Nobel laureates that we wrote about did. I don't know how he drank as much as he did and got as much done. You know, we have a romantic notion that if you're a writer, you're likely to be alcoholic or something, but it's really in spite of that and what drive he must have had to have been as sick a person as he was with his alcoholism and still have the output that he had is just amazing.
Absolutely.
But he had a balloonist drop into his yard one time, was one of the stories that I like. That a man was trying to do a hot air balloon over their house when he was a little kid, about 10 years old. And it was they were doing it in town. I think it was Oxford, Mississippi. They were there then. And the guy was drunk, the balloonist, and he didn't get it fully full. And he crashed in their yard, and it was all chaotic. Then he left, and his dad, Faulkner's dad, had come out with a pistol into the yard because he didn't know who this drunk man was and what was happening. So the man, after the balloonist was taken away, Faulkner's father turned around and shot a pig that was in the yard, just out of frustration. He turned and shot. I mean, so his life was a little crazy, as you might expect. So that's really my favorite one. And I wrote it for young adults because the publisher wanted college students to have access in English to these Nobel laureates' biographies. So for a college student for whom English wasn't a native language, Chinese students, it needed to be about the 6th or 7th grade level English. So that was a challenge, but really kind of fun. Chris Green says that the book on Jean-Paul Sartre, that biography, he says that's Sartre for kiddies.
And since you mentioned that, we'll talk about him, John Paul Sartre, a biography for kiddies. And who was he, briefly?
Oh, he is one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century, an existentialist philosopher, and one of my favorite. He was a radical leftist, and he was so sure of himself that he would do things, even when he was famous, he wasn't too dignified. He would stand up on a barrel and hand out leaflets to workers who were on strike. And he was ridiculed some for that, but he was also loved by the French people for his devotion to workers and to, the cause of equality.
Very
So
cool.
I'm really glad to have done that one too.
Yeah, it was very interesting too to read some of that. And then when you mentioned Pearl Buck, we've got that biography here that you and Christina St. Clair did. And then the last one I wanted to ask you about was Between Absurdity and Reality, a biography of Harold Pinter. Who was Harold Pinter?
Pinter was an English playwright who won the 2005 Nobel Prize, and I didn't know his work very well. He was the publisher's choice. They wanted to be sure to include him. I think that he may be like Buck, especially popular in China. So I learned a lot doing him, and it was good to. He was in London during the Blitz. He was one of the children that they took. They took trainloads of children away when Germany was bombing. London. Mm-hmm. So he left home, and I think that marked him. That was a really hard period for him, and of course a lot of other children. But he's an absurdist and very different, and of course a playwright, very different from Faulkner or any of the other people that we wrote about.
So I wanted to ask you, what are you working on next? What is Eddie Pendarvis up to now?
Well, I'm sort of working on a novel, but I'm really not a fiction writer. I think I'm really a poet. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that comes most naturally to me. So I'm trying to work on a novel about Florida and about drug running in the 1950s because I'm interested in the overthrow of the Batista regime. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure that'll happen in my lifetime.
So it's a long-term project.
Yes.
Understand.
Yes.
Very good. Well, Eddie, in our final moments, if someone wants to get in contact with you to talk to you about your poetry collections, Ghost Dance poems, Like the Mountains of China, to talk to you more about Appalachian Murders and Mysteries, or any of the 4 Nobel laureate biographies that you've done, how can they get in contact with you, and where can they get copies of your works?
Okay, Pendarvis at marshall.edu. Marshall's kind and still lets us keep our parking places if we're retired, and our email addresses. So it's without the S on the end, just Pendarvis at marshall.edu. And the Jesse Stewart Foundation or Blair Mountain Press, either one.
Okay, very good. Excellent. Eddie Pendarvis has been our guest here today, talking to us about her career, her outstanding collection of works, including Ghost Dance poems, Like Mountains of China, the Appalachian Murders and Mysteries series. She's also the author of Raft, Tide, and Railroad, How We Lived and Died, a number of poems and essays that have been in a lot of different publications, including Appalachian Journal, Cafe Review, Indiana Review, and Louisville Review. She's an editor. She's a retired professor at Marshall University, and just continues to write and edit and have a wonderful career post teaching at Marshall. So Eddie, congratulations on all your works, and thanks so much for coming by Chapters today to talk to us about it and about your career, and we look forward to having you back on as things continue to develop. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Eliot. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. And we want to take a moment to thank the staff and management of Empire Books and News for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to Empire Books and News to ask them about some of Eddie Pendarvis's works, and also to check out some of the other author, editor, and publisher interviews and their works that we have available for you for sale right here at Empire Books and News, right at Pullman Square in downtown Huntington. So come by, talk to Christine Dargish and her staff, and they can get you taken care of with any reading taste that you may need satisfied right here at Empire Books and News. And we appreciate their sponsorship of our program each and every episode here on Chapters. And if you like to interact with social media, we've got a variety of different platforms to make that possible for you. One of the easiest ways you can reach us here on the program is via email. Our email address is right here at the bottom of the screen. Please make sure that you write your name and where you are writing from when you send us that correspondence so that we can keep track of that. If you like to watch programs on YouTube and you like to keep up with the Chapters program on YouTube, we have an Armstrong One Wire page via the YouTube channel through Armstrong Television, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen as well. Once you type that into your search bar, just click on the Chapters tab, and there you can find over 3 years of author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you there as well. And we also have a Facebook page. If you're a Facebook user, just go to facebook.com, type in the Chapters or Chapters Television Show in that information in the search tab at the top of the screen, and you can be connected to our most recent author, editor, and publisher interviews archived for you there as well, and also interact with viewers of the program through Facebook. So if you like Facebook, you like YouTube, or you like email, we've made it possible for you to stay in touch with the program right here through those social media platforms, and we know many of you have done that, and we appreciate that so much. So please keep those comments and feedback coming. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time, and in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.